During the Six-Day War of 1967, near the city of Nablus on the Jordanian front, a tank battle played out whose outcome no military analyst could have predicted. An Israeli light tank weighing just 14.5 tons, with armor thin enough to be pierced by a heavy machine gun, knocked out 7 American M48 Pattons in a matter of minutes. Each of those machines tipped the scales at about 46 tons and was widely regarded as one of the best medium tanks of that era. The crew of the French-built AMX-13 exploited the blistering rate of fire of its gun and a clever set of tactics, turning formidable enemies into burning wrecks in the middle of a rocky desert. So, how did a country that experienced defeat in World War II go on to develop a highly influential light tank? It all started in 1940, when German armored spearheads punched through French defenses in the Ardennes and brought one of Europe's strongest armies to its knees in just 6 weeks. France actually had excellent tanks, many of which outperformed German machines in both armor and firepower. But French military doctrine was hopelessly outdated, and the high command simply didn't grasp the principles of maneuver warfare. Tanks were parceled out across infantry units, instead of being massed into strike groups. Communication between units was abysmal, and decisions were made so slowly that the Germans were always 2 steps ahead. The defeat cut deep into the national psyche, and French military leaders spent the years that followed picking apart what went wrong. As early as February 1945, with 3 months still to go before the fall of Berlin, the French General Staff kicked off work on a post-war rearmament program. The new armored warfare doctrine drew directly from the bitter lessons of defeat and rested on several key principles. Reconnaissance units were to get highly mobile vehicles with enough firepower to take on enemy tanks. Light tanks would no longer be treated as support weapons. They were to become fast hunters, capable of hitting hard and vanishing before the enemy could react. The technical requirements for the new light tank also reflected France's post-war colonial realities. In Indochina, Algeria, and other overseas territories, independence movements were picking up steam, and the army needed a vehicle that could be rapidly transported by air. The General Staff capped the weight at 13 tons, which would allow the tank to be carried by the transport aircraft of the day. At the same time, its armament had to match that of a medium tank, and the hull design had to accommodate different types of weapons. In other words, the French were asking for the impossible, a lightweight machine with the punch of something far heavier. In 1946, the Design Bureau at Issy-les-Moulineaux began working on a project designated AMX-13. The number in the name referred to the target weight of 13 tons, though production vehicles ended up weighing quite a bit more. The main engineering breakthrough was the oscillating turret, a concept first tried on an experimental Panhard Model 201 vehicle before the war. The design made it possible to solve several problems at once, problems that seemed impossible to reconcile in a conventional layout. Originally, the designers planned to fit the tank with a Mathis 8 GB20 engine, putting out 250 horsepower. The horizontally opposed 8-cylinder aviation engine had been used in training aircraft and seaplanes, but Mathis went bankrupt, forcing the team to look for alternatives. In the end, they went with a SOFAM Model 8 GXB engine of the same power output, which turned out to be a perfectly solid choice. The first prototype was ready for testing in 1948, and by 1949, 4 more experimental vehicles had been built. Testing showed that the air transportability requirement was unrealistic without serious compromises in protection and armament. The French Army made the smart call to drop that constraint in favor of real-world combat performance. The first production order was placed in 1951, and by 1952, the factory in Rouen had started rolling tanks off the line. The first production vehicles went to the 8th Hussars Regiment, and the French Army finally had a modern light tank of its own design. The oscillating turret of the AMX-13 was a good decade ahead of its time. Unlike conventional tank turrets, where the gun elevates and depresses inside a fixed structure, the French engineers split the turret into two halves. The lower half rotated on the hull ring, handling traverse, while the upper half pivoted against the lower, raising and lowering the gun along with the entire mechanism. Because the gun sat significantly higher than in a standard tank, it had a real edge when firing from cover or behind terrain features. The biggest payoff was that the design made room for an autoloader, something that would have eaten up far too much space in a traditional turret. On either side of the gun's breech, the French designers placed two drum magazines, each holding 6 rounds. The way the mechanism worked was deceptively straightforward. After each shot, the recoil force rotated the drum, indexing the next round onto a loading tray lined up with the barrel's bore. The autoloader then rammed the shell into the breech. The breech closed, and the tank was ready to fire again. The rate of fire caught military observers off guard. 10, sometimes even 12 rounds per minute, turned the AMX-13 into a rapid-fire cannon on tracks. For comparison, the crew of a medium tank with manual loading could manage no more than 6 to 8 rounds in the same time, and only if the loader was well drilled and not running on fumes. The French machine could pump out shells so fast that the enemy simply couldn't figure out where the fire was coming from before their tank was already up in flames. Swiss tankers, who received the AMX-13 under the designation Light Tank 51, took the use of that rate of fire to a whole other level. They came up with a unique double-shot tactic that let them land hits on the very first engagement. The gunner would fire 2 rounds in under 10 seconds. The first on a flat trajectory for short and medium distances, the second at an angle for longer ranges. One of the two was almost guaranteed to connect, and the crew didn't have to waste precious seconds dialing in their aim. An enemy that suddenly popped up would catch 2 armor-piercing rounds before it could even swing its turret toward the threat. But the design came at a price, and the French engineers knew it from the start. Once all 12 rounds in the drums were spent, the tank was essentially defenseless out in the open. Reloading the magazines meant stopping the vehicle and the crew climbing out through hatches in the turret roof. Doing that under enemy fire was basically a death sentence. So after burning through its ammo, the AMX-13 had to immediately pull back to a safe zone. That constraint shaped the tank's entire combat doctrine. Hit fast, hit hard, get out. The oscillating turret also created other headaches that the designers only ran into once the tanks were actually in the field. The maximum gun elevation was limited by the gap between the rear of the turret and the hull roof. When the upper turret section rocked upward, it would hit the tank's deck, making any further elevation physically impossible. As a result, the elevation angle topped out at just 13 degrees, less than most tanks with a conventional layout. The depression angle of -6 degrees, some sources cite up to -8, let the tank fire from hull-down positions, but even here the AMX-13 came up short compared to some rivals. The 2-part turret was also inherently weaker than the solid one-piece turrets on conventional tanks. The gap between the upper and lower halves was extremely hard to seal, which caused trouble when fording rivers and left the vehicle exposed in NBC scenarios. Water and air would seep into the fighting compartment, and keeping the crew safe from toxic agents was practically impossible. A serious worry during the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear and chemical attack loomed large. Another major shortcoming was the inability to shoot accurately on the move. The sheer mass of the oscillating turret section made vertical gun stabilization a nightmare from an engineering standpoint. The hydraulic turret drive had no stabilization or fire control system, so the gunner couldn't keep the crosshairs on target while the tank was rolling. The AMX-13 had to come to a full stop to shoot, which in the middle of a fast-moving tank fight could get the crew killed. French tankers made up for it by picking their positions carefully and using terrain to sneak into firing spots undetected. The tank's official French Army designation was Char Très Tonnes 75 Modèle 51, reflecting its weight and the caliber of its main gun. The first production vehicles were fitted with a 75mm CN 7550 gun with a double baffle muzzle brake, a direct descendant of the famous German KWK 42 cannon that had sat in the turret of Panther tanks and was feared by tankers on all sides during the war. The French shortened the barrel to 57 calibers, while keeping its excellent penetration and accuracy at medium ranges. The hull of the AMX-13 was built up from welded steel plates with differentiated protection. The frontal armor reached 40 millimeters and could shrug off hits from heavy machine guns and small caliber autocannons. The sides and turret ranged from 20 to 25 millimeters, enough to stop shrapnel and small arms fire. The hull floor was just 10 millimeters thick and combined with modest ground clearance that made the vehicle a sitting duck for mines. The French designers deliberately traded protection for mobility and firepower, following the philosophy that a light tank is a hunter, not a frontline brawler. Beyond reconnaissance units, the AMX-13 was also issued to regular armored formations, originally as a stopgap until heavier French-designed tanks could enter service. The ARL-44 and AMX-50 programs were meant to give the French Army powerful machines capable of going toe-to-toe with heavy tanks. But both programs fell through due to technical problems and budget constraints, and the light tank ended up staying in frontline units way longer than anyone had planned. It wasn't until the AMX-30 medium tank entered production in the early 1960s that things finally started to change. The Rouen factory's production lines were taken over by the new medium tank, and AMX-13 production moved to Creusot-Loire in 1964, which kept building them all the way through 1987. Over that time, roughly 7,700 vehicles in various configurations rolled off the line. Argentina bought a production license and manufactured the tanks at its own factories from 1968 to 1985. Over 25 countries on 4 continents purchased the French light tank, making it one of the most widely produced Western armored vehicles of the post-war era. The AMX-13 saw its baptism of fire in October 1956 during the Suez Crisis. Egyptian President Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, triggering a furious response from Britain, France, and Israel. The 3 countries drew up a plan for a military operation to seize the strategic waterway and bring down the Egyptian government. France sent Foreign Legion units into the conflict zone, including 2 sections of AMX-13s from the 2nd Foreign Cavalry Regiment. The French tanks came ashore at Port Fouad to reinforce the 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment. The Israeli Army used the AMX-13 on a much bigger scale. A tank battalion from the 27th Brigade, rolling in French machines, made a rapid push across the Sinai Peninsula and reached the Suez Canal. On November 1st, during the Battle of Rafah, Israeli armored forces slammed into Egyptian defenses, reinforced with dug-in tanks and artillery. In that fight, the Israelis took significant losses in AMX-13s, but they punched through the enemy positions and kept the advance going. The real moment of glory for the French tank came at the Battle of Bir al-Salim, where Israeli AMX-13s went up against Egyptian armored forces. The enemy had T-34 tanks and Su-100 self-propelled guns, the latter feared for their powerful 100mm cannon. Israeli crews leaned on the superior rate of fire of their machines and picked their attack positions with care. The outcome went far beyond what anyone expected. According to Israeli accounts, around 30 Egyptian T-34s and 18 Su-100s were destroyed or abandoned by their crews, though exact figures remain debated. Light tanks, whose armor could theoretically be punched through by even an anti-aircraft gun, had crushed an enemy with greater numbers and heavier protection. The Suez Crisis proved that the AMX-13 concept held up in real combat, that speed, firepower, and smart positioning could beat heavier opponents. 9 years later, the French light tank found itself at the heart of another major conflict, this time on the other side of Asia. In September 1965, a full-blown war broke out between India and Pakistan over the disputed Kashmir region. Both sides threw significant armored forces into the fight, and it was the tank battles that ultimately tipped the scales. Pakistan fielded its first armored division, equipped with 264 American M47 and M48 Patton tanks, considered among the finest fighting vehicles of the era. The Indian Army had a mixed bag that included British Centurions, American Shermans, and French AMX-13s. The 8th Cavalry Regiment was armed with the light French machines, which on paper were outmatched by the Pakistani Pattons in every way that mattered. The American tanks weighed nearly 3 times as much, carried thicker armor, and packed a powerful 90mm gun. On paper, a head-to-head should have ended in a quick wipeout of the Indian side. From September 8th to 10th, near the village of Asal-Uttar, one of the biggest tank battles since World War II went down. The Pakistani 1st Armored Division launched an offensive, expecting to smash through the Indian defense and break into open country. But Indian commanders had laid a deadly trap. The terrain around Asal-Uttar was sugarcane fields, crisscrossed by irrigation canals, and the Indians had deliberately flooded them. The heavy Pattons bogged down in the mud, losing their main advantage, mobility. Indian tankers in their AMX-13s used the lightness of their machines to fight a war of maneuver. The low ground pressure of the French tanks let them go where the American machines got hopelessly stuck. Crews of the 8th Cavalry would swing around to the enemy's flank, dump their magazines at a devastating rate of fire, and pull back to reload while the Pakistani tankers struggled to get their mired vehicles turned around. The Battle of Asal-Uttar ended in the total destruction of Pakistan's 1st Armored Division, which lost 97 tanks. The AMX-13s of the 8th Cavalry fought alongside Sherman and Centurion tanks. Indian anti-tank gunners with recoilless rifles also played a key role, with Havildar Abdul Hamid destroying several Pattons before being killed in action, earning India's highest military honor. The Indians later nicknamed the place Patton Nagar, the graveyard of Pattons. But the war wasn't over, and in later engagements, Indian AMX-13s had to take on the enemy under far less favorable conditions. An entire company of French tanks was wiped out, trying to stop a Pakistani regiment backed by fresh M48 Pattons. Out in the open, with no terrain to duck behind, and without the advantage of flooded fields, the light machines were sitting ducks for the powerful guns of the American tanks. The thin armor couldn't hold up against 90mm rounds, and crews were getting killed before they could even bring their rate of fire advantage to bear. The hard lessons of all these conflicts made it clear that the AMX-13's armament needed a serious upgrade. The 75mm gun, which had handled tanks from the 1940s and early 1950s just fine, was becoming less and less effective against newer vehicles with thicker armor. In the early 1960s, a version showed up with a 90mm CN-90F3 gun fitted with a thermal sleeve on the barrel. It could fire armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds and shaped charge ammo, giving the vehicle a major boost in anti-tank capability. The next step was bolting on a 105mm CN-105 gun in a new FL-12 turret, designed specifically for the export market. The shaped charge round from this gun had a muzzle velocity of 800 meters per second and could punch through 400mm of armor, making it more than capable of taking out any modern tank from the side or rear. After that came the FL-15 turret with better observation equipment and the option to fit a fire control system for faster target acquisition. Alongside the gun upgrades, the French also kitted out some tanks with anti-tank guided missiles. 4 SS-11 missiles were mounted on the front of the turret, capable of reaching out to targets well beyond what a tank gun could touch. Peruvian AMX-13s got anti-tank missiles too, and some vehicles were stripped of their guns entirely and converted into dedicated missile-armed tank destroyers. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against the Arab states, kicking off a war that would last just 6 days, but permanently redraw the map of the Middle East. The Israeli Air Force wiped out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, securing total air superiority. Now the outcome would come down to ground forces, and armored units on both sides were racing toward each other. AMX-13s were once again on the front lines, even though by this point the French machines were considered outdated next to the more modern Centurions and upgraded Shermans. On the Sinai front, the Israeli light tanks faced a tough opponent. The Egyptian army was fielding T-54s and even heavy IS-3s, whose armor laughed off the 75mm rounds from the French guns. On the evening of June 6th, an AMX-13 tank battalion from Abraham's brigade was pushing along the road to Bir el-Gifgafa when it ran into 2 battalions of Egyptian T-54s. The ground played right into the Egyptians' hands. No cover, no room to maneuver. Several Israeli tanks and half-track APCs were knocked out in the opening minutes. The 75mm rounds simply bounced off the frontal armor of the T-54s, which ran over 100mm thick. Israeli crews tried flanking, pouring on their superior rate of fire, and some managed to score hits. The Egyptian T-54s took losses from flank shots as well. But the overall balance of forces was stacked against the light French tanks, and the battalion was forced to fall back, leaving burning vehicles and fallen comrades on the field. Things went very differently on the Jordanian front, where the AMX-13s came up against American M47s and M48 Pattons. The Jordanian army had gotten these tanks from the United States and believed its armored forces were fully capable of standing up to the Israelis. But the Jordanian tankers lacked the combat experience the Israelis had built up over years of fighting. On top of that, coordination between Jordanian units was a mess, which let the Israelis pick them apart piece by piece. Near Nablus, a battle unfolded that would go down in the annals of armored warfare. The bulk of the 2nd Jordanian Tank Battalion found itself caught between 2 Israeli tank battalions in a textbook pincer, and their commanders couldn't put together an effective response. Israeli AMX-13 crews used every fold in the terrain, every rise and every ditch to get into advantageous positions. They'd let the enemy close to effective range, unload all 12 rounds at maximum rate of fire, and pull back to reload while other vehicles kept the pressure on. It was in this battle that one Israeli AMX-13 reportedly pulled off a feat that reads like fiction. The crew of a light tank that barely weighed a third of its target destroyed 7 Jordanian Pattons, machines with far thicker armor and a bigger gun. The Israeli tanker found their weak spots and didn't give them time to respond. When the smoke cleared, the 2nd Jordanian Tank Battalion had been virtually wiped out, and the battlefield was littered with the charred hulks of American-made tanks. The 6-day war was the last major conflict in which the AMX-13 saw action in large-scale tank battles. Combat experience had proven that against modern medium tanks with heavy armor, the French machines could only come out on top when their crews played their tactical cards right. Out in the open, in a straight-up fight against T-54s, or IS-3s, the light tank was doomed. But in the right hands, with smart use of terrain and the element of surprise, the AMX-13 remained a deadly opponent, even against machines that outweighed and outgunned it on every spec sheet. After the 6-day war, AMX-13 production kept going for another 20 years. Tanks were shipped to countries across Southeast Asia and South America, where humid climates and lousy infrastructure made the tank's low ground pressure a critical advantage. Singapore, Indonesia, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela all upgraded their vehicles with new engines, transmissions, and fire control systems. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, all 5 of these countries were still running AMX-13s well into the 21st century. If you enjoyed the story of this lightly armored but deadly French warrior, hit that like button and tell us in the comments which tank you'd like to hear about next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes about legendary fighting machines.